All right, listeners, buckle up. We're about to take a deep dive into something super interesting, something called mimetic desire. As learners, you guys know we like to cut to the chase, so today we're going to break down how this sneaky little force might be shaping what you want, like without you even realizing it? So you sent over some seriously fascinating stuff on mimetic theory, especially those bits from Luke Burgess's book, Wanting. So think of this as our mission today. We're going to figure out how mimetic desire actually works, spot its traces in your life, and hey, maybe we'll even uncover some tactics for setting goals that are actually truly yours, the real deal. And to guide us through this quest for authenticity, we have our expert.
Glad to be here. One of the things that really grabs me about mimetic desire is that it kind of turns everything we think we know about what we want on its head.
Turns it on its head. How so?
Well, we usually assume that our desires, they just come from within us,
Yeah.
right? Like they're innate. But mimetic theory says, hold on a sec, a lot of those desires, they're actually borrowed.
Borrowed desires. Okay, now that's a new one.
Right. It's a pretty mind-blowing idea. Basically, we're looking to models, people or things we admire to tell us what's worth wanting.
So instead of some inner compass, we're taking cues from others.
Exactly. And Burgess has this perfect example in his book. Think back to when you were a kid, right? Did you really want that toy, or did it suddenly become the thing to have because your friend had it?
Oh man, I can totally relate to that. It's like those old toy commercials. All those kids going nuts for the latest gizmo. Makes you wonder how much of that was real excitement and how much was, well, mimetic desire.
Right. I mean, mimesis itself, that act of imitation, is not inherently bad. In fact, it's super important for learning, for culture, for all of that. I mean, we learn language, we learn how to behave, even our values, by watching and imitating others. It's natural.
So how do we know when it's healthy mimesis and when it's leading us down the wrong path?
That's where Girard's two worlds of desire come in, Celebristan and Freshmanistan.
Oh yeah, I remember those from the book. Those were some pretty vivid descriptions.
They were. So in Celebristan, you've got your celebrities, your historical icons, those larger-than-life figures we admire from a distance. And because they're so far removed, there's not really a chance for direct competition. So the desire is more aspirational, like you admire them, but you're not trying to outdo them.
Like admiring a far-off star.
Yeah.
Right? You're inspired by it, but you're not trying to take its place. But Freshmanistan, that's a whole different story, isn't it?
Totally. Freshmanistan is where the models are up close and personal. Your friends, your coworkers, maybe even that influencer whose perfect life makes you question your own choices. And the closer the model, the higher the stakes, the more intense the rivalry can get. It's like, think of that analogy in the book. A crowded race. It's not just about finishing. It's about beating the person next to you.
And social media, I feel like that's turned our whole lives into one giant Freshmanistan. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with images of what other people have, what they're doing, what they're aiming for. It's like, how can you not compare yourself?
It's tough, right? And it's not just about the stuff. Burgess talks about metaphysical desire, too, this longing for a certain way of being.
So it's not just wanting the fancy car. It's wanting that whole feeling of success and freedom that you think comes with it.
Yeah.
You're mimicking an entire fulfillment story, like the book calls it.
Exactly. And those stories, whether we're aware of them or not, they have a huge impact on our choices. They shape our careers, our relationships, even how we see ourselves.
And maybe this is the scary part, is that we can get so caught up in imitating others that we completely lose sight of what we really want.
That's the romantic lie in action, as Burgess calls it. The illusion that all our desires are truly our own. We end up chasing someone else's version of success, maybe living a life that doesn't even resonate with our deepest values.
And sometimes those models have no idea they're influencing us. It's wild. Like there was that story about Edward Bernays in one of the excerpts you shared. He basically convinced women to start smoking by linking cigarettes with torches of freedom.
It's a classic example of how mimetic desire can be manipulated. He tapped into this deep cultural desire for liberation, turned cigarettes into symbols of empowerment, and bam, sales of Lucky Strikes went through the roof.
It's fascinating, but also kind of terrifying. It makes you wonder, how many of our desires are really ours? And how many have we just, absorbed from really good manipulators like Bernays?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. So how do we tell the difference between those desires we've picked up from others and the ones that are truly authentic?
Now, that's a great question, and that's a perfect place to start exploring the practical side of all this mimetic theory stuff.
Perfect. Okay, so how do we untangle all these borrowed desires? How do we figure out what we actually want? I mean, the whole idea of mimetic desire is fascinating, but it's kind of overwhelming too.
I get it, it can feel like a lot, but the good news is there are things we can actually do about it. Burgess lays out a bunch of tactics for developing what he calls anti-mimetic practices, ways to kind of break free from all the unhealthy mimesis. And it's not about like erasing desire completely, it's more about understanding how it affects us and choosing our models carefully, you know.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, one of the most powerful things, and probably the easiest, is something he calls naming your models. It's like shining a spotlight on those hidden forces that are shaping what we want.
So just becoming aware of who's influencing us, is that what you mean?
Exactly. Think about it. Who do you really admire? Who makes you feel like a twinge of envy? Whose life do you secretly wish you had? Those are all clues to who your models might be. And it might not be the obvious people either, you know. It could be a friend, a colleague, even that Instagram account you can't stop checking.
Oh man, I know exactly what you mean. There are definitely a few Instagram accounts that make me want, well, everything. But okay, let's say I've figured out who some of my models are. What then? Do I just unfollow them all and try to live in some kind of mimetic bubble?
Not quite. It's more about like diversifying your sources of inspiration. Burgess calls this finding sources of wisdom that withstand mimesises. Think about it. If all you're ever exposed to are messages about status, wealth, all that stuff, it's easy to get pulled in by that. But if you start looking at different perspectives, ones that aren't so influenced by trends and social pressure, you start to get a much more solid sense of what truly matters to you.
So what are some examples of those kinds of sources? Where do we even find them?
Oh, there are tons of possibilities. It could be classic literature, philosophy, spiritual texts, even nature itself. Think about those voices that have lasted through time across cultures. They offer insights into what it means to be human that can really help us connect with those deeper values. And it doesn't have to be ancient or super complicated stuff either. Burgess talks about Viktor Frankl. He's the guy who found meaning and purpose even in a Nazi concentration camp. I mean, talk about unimaginable suffering.
That's incredible. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. And it reminds us that true fulfillment often comes from something much deeper than those flashy desires that we're constantly bombarded with.
And speaking of those flashy desires, one of the tactics that really stuck with me was invest in deep silence.
Hmm.
I think we could all use a bit more of that in this crazy, hyper-connected world.
Totally. In a world that's constantly screaming for our attention, silence can almost feel rebellious. But it's in those quiet moments that we can finally hear our own inner voice, connect with our intuition and those desires that aren't being dictated by everyone else.
It's like getting off that crazy spinning ride and finally feeling solid ground under your feet again.
Exactly. And Burgess even talks about how powerful silent retreats can be to really disconnect from the noise and reconnect with yourself. Now, I know a multi-day retreat isn't for everyone, but even finding little pockets of silence every day can make a huge difference.
So meditation, walks in nature, maybe just putting the phone away for a while and just being present in the moment.
Absolutely. Anything that gives you that space to reflect, to step back from all the mimetic frenzy and ask yourself, what do I really want? What matters to me?
Okay, so we've talked a lot about breaking free from all the negative mimesis. But is imitation always bad? Like, is there ever a time when it's actually a good thing?
Oh, for sure. Imitation, it's essential for learning, for growth. It's how we develop skills, learn new things, even build relationships. The key is to be mindful of who we're imitating and why, and to make sure it aligns with our own values.
So it's about being selective, not just blindly following the crowd.
Exactly. And actually, Burgess talks about using imitation strategically to fuel innovation. He suggests looking at models who've achieved things you admire and then figuring out how to adapt their strategies to your own situation.
That's really interesting. So instead of trying to be the next, I don't know, insert popular figure, we can learn from their success, but create something new, something authentic to us.
Right. He gives this great example of Giro Sport Design, the company that totally revolutionized helmet design. They didn't just copy what was already out there, they looked at other industries like aerospace engineering to come up with something truly innovative. And they were smart. They partnered with a top cyclist, Greg LeMond, who wore their helmets in the Tour de France, which made everyone want them even more.
Wow, that's a perfect example of how mimetic desire can actually be a force for good, for creativity, for progress. And it kind of ties into another one of Burgess's tactics. Share stories of deeply fulfilling action.
Yes. This one's all about recognizing and celebrating those moments in our lives when we felt truly satisfied, truly purposeful. He calls them fulfillment stories. And they're like gold mines for understanding what we truly desire.
I love that. So it's not just about thinking about our desires, it's about connecting with those times when we've actually felt fulfilled, when we've been in that flow state, when we've been our truest selves, and then sharing those stories with others.
Exactly. By sharing them, we gain clarity for ourselves, but we also inspire other people to do the same. It's like a positive feedback loop of authentic desire where we're encouraging each other to go after what really matters.
That's a really powerful concept. It shifts the focus from what we think we should want to what we genuinely want based on our own experiences.
Which leads us to thick desires and thin desires, right?
Yeah.
You got it. Burgess talks about thick desires being those desires that are deeply rooted in our values, the ones that bring lasting fulfillment. They're the things that light us up, give us a sense of purpose, make us feel truly alive. Thin desires, on the other hand, are more fleeting, more superficial. They're often driven by needing validation from others or wanting to fit in.
Okay, so how do we figure out which desires are thick and which ones are thin? I mean, it's not always super obvious, right?
You're right, it can be tricky. It takes some real reflection and honestly some trial and error. Burgess suggests paying attention to those times when we felt deeply fulfilled, those fulfillment stories we were just talking about, and look for patterns. What activities, what achievements have brought you lasting joy, lasting satisfaction, and what were the motivations behind those things?
So it's like doing a deep dive into our own personal history, looking for clues to what really makes us tick.
Exactly. And sometimes those clues are right in front of us. We just have to look for them. Burgess even created this assessment tool in his book called the Motivation Code, or MPODI. It's designed to help people figure out their core motivational drives.
Oh, right. You mentioned you took that assessment. What was that like?
It was really interesting. It helped me see why I'm drawn to certain types of projects and why others just drain me, even if they seem like they should be fulfilling. It was like getting a glimpse into how my own desires work.
That's amazing. So if we understand those core drives, we can start setting goals that are actually aligned with what we truly want, not just what we think we should want.
Exactly. And I think that's how we find real fulfillment. And honestly, I think it could lead to a better world, too.
Okay, I'm sensing we're about to zoom out to the bigger picture. So far, we've been talking about mimetic desire on a personal level. But you said earlier that it has implications for society as a whole, too. So how does that all work?
Well, think about some of the problems we see in the world today. Political division, social unrest, even the environmental crisis. A lot of that comes from a sense of scarcity. Competition, this feeling that someone else is always winning and we're losing out.
So we're talking scarcity, competition, that feeling that someone's always getting ahead while we're falling behind. How does that tie into mimetic desire?
Well, if you're always comparing yourself to others, you're going to end up feeling envious, resentful, even blaming others for your own situation.
Yeah, it's a recipe for negativity for sure.
And that brings us to this big idea in mimetic theory, the scapegoat mechanism.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part from the book. Kind of a dark topic, isn't it? So how does that whole thing work?
When there's a lot of mimetic rivalry in a group, it builds up tension and conflict. And to deal with that conflict, the group often looks for someone to blame. It's like an unconscious thing. They need a scapegoat, someone to take the fall for all their problems.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It can be, yeah. Throughout history, we've seen how the scapegoat mechanism leads to all kinds of awful things, persecution, even genocide. But it happens on smaller scales, too, in families, at work, even online. Think of cancel culture, for example.
Yeah, it's like this mob mentality, people jumping on someone who's seen as different or threatening.
Exactly. It might feel justified in the moment, but it often comes from that unconscious mimetic rivalry, this need to feel morally superior to someone else.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? I mean, it's easy to get caught up in it when everyone else is doing it.
Awareness is a big part of it. Just knowing about the scapegoat mechanism can make you think twice before judging someone too quickly. And it's also about empathy, remembering that everyone's dealing with their own stuff, their own desires and insecurities.
That's a good point. It's easy to demonize people when you don't understand where they're coming from.
You're right. Which leads to another important question. If mimetic desire can be so destructive, can we use it for good?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We've talked a lot about the downsides of mimetic desire, but you mentioned earlier that it can be a positive force, too.
Absolutely. That's where the idea of transcendent leadership comes in.
Oh, right. I remember Burgess talking about that in the book. It's about having a different kind of model, right?
Exactly. He talks about two kinds of leaders, those driven by imminent desire and those driven by transcendent desire.
Okay, imminent versus transcendent. Break that down for me.
Leaders with imminent desire They're stuck in that mimetic rivalry game. They're always striving for more. More
Ah,
power, more status, more of everything. And they create this environment around them where everyone's competing for those same things.
it's like that spinning ride, the gravitron that Burgess talks about. Everyone's trying to get to the center, and the leader's right there calling the shots.
Exactly. And that kind of leadership, it just creates more resentment, more envy, and a lot of unfulfilled desires. But transcendent leaders, they're different. They have a different model, one that's outside that whole system of rivalry.
So they're not playing that same game of one-upmanship.
Nope. They're focused on something bigger than themselves, something beyond their own ego. Think of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, or even someone like Malala Yousafzai. They were all driven by this desire for justice, for equality, for a better world. And that kind of leadership, it inspires people to want those things too.
So instead of just telling people what to do, they're inviting them to join them on this meaningful journey.
Exactly. That's the power of transcendent leadership. It can actually change the direction of desire, move us away from those petty rivalries, and towards a shared purpose.
That's a really powerful idea. But how do we cultivate that kind of leadership? I mean, it's one thing to admire those figures from afar, but how do we embody those qualities in our own lives?
Great question. Burgess actually outlines several key skills that transcendent leaders have. One is that ability to shift gravity, like we were talking about. Another is increasing the speed of truth.
Speed of truth. What does that even mean?
It means creating an environment where honesty and transparency are valued, where information is shared freely and people can speak their minds without being afraid.
So no more secrets or power games. It's about building trust and open communication.
Exactly. That kind of environment is key for innovation, for collaboration, and for creating a more just and equitable world.
That makes a lot of sense. Any other important skills?
Well, Burgess also talks about using imitation to drive innovation. We touched on that earlier, but it's worth repeating. Transcendent leaders, they're great at learning from the best, but they don't just copy. They take inspiration from people who have achieved amazing things, and then they adapt those strategies to their own situation.
So it's about channeling mimetic desire in a way that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
You got it. And I think that's a key takeaway from all this talk about mimetic desire. It's not about getting rid of desire completely. It's about understanding how it works, choosing your models wisely, and then using that energy to create a world where everyone can thrive.
Wow, what a message. We've covered a lot today, from the personal to the big picture, from the negative side of mimetic desire to its potential for positive change.
We have, and I think it comes down to this. Your desires are powerful. Choose your models carefully. And don't be afraid to be the kind of leader who inspires others to want something more, something better, something truly transcendent.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into mimetic desire. It's given me a lot to think about.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for being here. We hope this episode has given you some new insights into the hidden forces that shape our desires, and maybe some tools for breaking free from all that comparison and rivalry that can hold us back.
Remember, your desires are yours to shape. Choose wisely.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.